Today's message is a story, wondering what would happen if a modern-style reporter interviewed Caiaphas, the high priest in the time of Jesus. Caiaphas read the note that his secretary had given him and nodded with satisfaction. Jesus was no longer going to be a problem. He was dead. He would soon be buried and gone. It was a shame it had to be done, but Caiaphas believed in keeping his eye on the big picture. "Excuse me," a voice said. He swung around and saw a young man standing a few feet away holding a pad and pen. "Yes, I was wondering if you could give me an interview." Caiaphas barely kept his eyes from rolling. A reporter? That was the last thing he needed. "First of all, I need to know a few things," Caiaphas said, not caring if he sounded blunt. "Who are you and where are you from?" "I'm Ezekiel, son of Tobias, and I'm from the Jerusalem Gazette." He pulled a card from his pocket. "Here are my credentials." Caiaphas examined the card and glanced at him suspiciously. "You don't also write for the Israel Purpose?" Ezekiel made a face. "Heck, no! I've seen copies of it lying around. That publication is dangerous. You simply can't say things as baldly as they do, especially in dangerous times like these." "Is that the official policy at the Jerusalem Gazette?" "You should hear our owner talk about it," Ezekiel said. "He says no one would pay for advertising in a newspaper that could get you arrested for just reading it." That was encouraging, at least if the man was telling the truth. "Good to hear it. At least someone sensible at the Gazette. Sometimes it's necessary to hide the facts from people. There are plenty of fools in our country today who don't see the big picture." "But you do?" Caiaphas gave a less than humorous chuckle. "You don't think I'd be high priest otherwise?" "Quite right. So you won't mind answering a few questions?" "I'd rather have you talk with my public relations man." "I've already done that, but my readers would prefer hearing directly from you. After all, you are the high priest, and this matter is extremely sensitive. I want to be sure we get it right." It was hard not to feel suspicious about the reporter's motives. Caiaphas tended to be suspicious about everyone's motives. Life was safer that way. "I suppose you're the religion reporter for the newspaper." The man coughed and looked embarrassed. "Well, sir, to be honest, most of the time I do the obituaries and the Dear Naomi section. But I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention the last part to anyone." "I thought that Dear Naomi was written by, someone named Naomi." "It was, but when she retired, I got stuck with the job. You know, finances are hard these days, and the paper didn't want to hire anyone new. We're all doing extra duty over there. Our religion feature reporter is now also doing the comics. You may have noticed that lately there's been a lack of comic in the strip." Caiaphas had noticed, but he wasn't going to admit to reading that portion of the Gazette. "I don't waste time looking at the funny papers." "Oh. Well, Jacob took over when Barnabas the shepherd was heading for Jerusalem to try and sell his imaginary lamb for the Passover. In the comics, you would expect him to either fall flat in his face or make a fortune while someone else grabs a rope and leads off an invisible lamb." "On the contrary," Caiaphas said, "I think that having Barnabas head to the temple for a sacrifice of repentance was quite appropriate." The other man's eyebrows went upward. "Sorry, I thought you didn't read the comics." I don't usually, but someone insisted on showing me that piece." "Oh, yes, I can see how that must happen in your position, always having things pushed on you." Ezekiel nodded. So how about that interview? It would mean a great deal to our readers to hear your perspective on the situation." "I suppose I could give you a few minutes." "Well, there are a great many rumors about the man who was crucified this morning." Caiaphas knew what the reporter was referring to Jesus, but he refused to let that two-bit carpenter from Nazareth look more important than he was. "Which man?" he said in indifferent tones. "I understand there were 3 at Golgotha today." Ezekiel scratched the end of his nose before talking. "I'm talking about the one named Jesus. We had a tip that he was sent to the Romans by the council." "Oh, him. Yes, it seemed better for one man to die than for a whole nation to perish." "People say he was taking some good shots at the religious leadership. He charged them with hypocrisy, judgmentalism, self-righteousness, that sort of thing. How did you feel about that?" Drawing himself up with a proud expression, Caiaphas glared. "That had nothing to do with my decision. The man was dangerous. He stirred things up. The Romans wouldn't have tolerated him for long, and many others would have surely died before he was through. That's why I felt we had to be proactive about the situation." Still, it could have been comfortable to hear his criticisms. Caiaphas snorted. "The man was a peasant, a Nazarene, for heaven's sake. Some say he was a Pharisee who turned against his own class. Why would anyone pay attention to him?" "Well, haven't some people asked whether he was Elijah or perhaps a prophet?" "Idiots on the street can say whatever they want. This Jesus was nothing more than a misguided fool." Ezekiel scribbled notes fast before looking up again. "Well, I understand there are questions about the case against him. The trial was done in the night without everyone present. That's against policy. And witnesses contradicted each other. False evidence was presented. Aren't you supposed to throw out cases like that?" "We did what we had to do. The council did the math and figured the risks and the consequences, and that's all I will say about it, except I'm certain God approves. After all, don't the ends justify the means?" Surprised expression briefly crossed the reporter's face. "I see. So I take it his followers don't bother you?" "His followers, fishermen, farmers, even a tax collector. Jesus actually spoke to women and allowed them to be his disciples. They don't bother me in the least." The reporter again scribbled rapidly in his new notebook before continuing. "He certainly sounds like a radical. Was he a zealot?" "Not as far as I know. Never spoke about getting rid of Rome." "Then how could he be charged with trying to be a king?" Anger rose in Caiaphas. He'd hardly believed it when he heard what the Roman soldiers had posted over the head of Jesus on the cross. That peasant had been king of nothing, and certainly not of the Jewish nation. "Roman soldiers put up that sign on that cross," he said. "We objected, but they wouldn't take it down." Maybe the Romans had to have a capital offense to put in the records. After all, from reports I've heard, Pilate said he was innocent. Pilate worries about his position with Rome. I'm sure he wanted it both ways, to get rid of Jesus and still not be responsible for doing it. But you can't have your matzah and eat it too. Is that why he offered to release Jesus or Barabbas? Of course, I'll admit, when I heard he was going to offer the release of a prisoner, well, I worried at first. Jesus has been awfully popular with the people, though I have no idea why. Ezekiel said. "Is it true that he drove the money changers out of the temple courtyard?" "You bet he did. Jesus acted they were all thieves, and the temple leaders were equally thieves for allowing it. Well, I admit that the money changers make a hefty profit, but it helps support the temple, so what's the problem?" "None, I suppose. But given his popularity over such issues, how can you explain why the crowd asked for his crucifixion?" "Oh, Pilate knew what he was doing. The crowds who liked Jesus were naturally home at such a time. The type of rabble gathers for things like this in the middle of the night would certainly ask for Barabbas. Of course, I'm not crazy about him either. You know he killed someone during an uprising." "I suppose that would make him popular with the zealots and the rabble-rousers in Jerusalem." "Rome is a reality," Caiaphas said, "and considerably more powerful than the zealots imagine. I wish they'd get that through their thick skulls." "Yes, but aren't they counting on God to help them?" Ezekiel asked. Caiaphas drew himself up, his face darkening with the affront. "Are you questioning my faith?" Ezekiel's face reddened. "Of course not. As it happens, I agree with you. We get extra benefits from Rome that other people don't. If we want to keep what we've got, we have to accept the Romans aren't going anywhere." "It's a good thing you're so sensible. Someday God will deal with it. In the meantime, we do the best we can." "So is that the explanation for the council's actions regarding this whole Jesus matter?" "You can quote me on that." "Well, I don't want to offend you, but the irregularities in the case can't help but raise questions." Caiaphas grew angry. "You won't raise any questions, not if you don't want a whole lot of trouble. Do you understand?" "Oh, yes," Ezekiel answered hastily. "Of course I do. I'm only trying to clarify what I've heard. Oh, that was another thing. We heard that Jesus talked about truth and that Pilate asked him what truth was. Just trying to be clever, I suppose. Still, it's an interesting question to ask." especially at this time. You have to know how someone defines truth before you can have a conversation about it. Perhaps Governor Pilate was really curious. As far as I can see, truth is a dead issue, and you might as well write an obituary about it. I believe you said that's your regular job. The reporter cleared his throat. Yes, well, I'm afraid I did write up the obit for Jesus and called him the man of truth. You did what? Well, after all, the average folks in Jerusalem were in favor of the guy. But don't worry, our editor pulled it. We just put in the bare facts. Make sure to stress the fellow has been crucified as a criminal, along with other criminals. Look, I have important things to do. I have to finish. Well, thanks for the interview. You know, I'm sure no one will be interested in this Jesus for very long. Most probably won't even read this article. Yes, he's a dead issue. Let him lie in his grave and sink into dust. In a few days, no one will even remember his name. Caiaphas hesitated when the reporter offered him his hand, but finally shook it and hurried off to the next responsibility. All right, so his conscience troubled him a little, but there was no question that Jesus had been dangerous. It was better for one man to die than to risk the whole nation. But no matter what the reporter had said, it hadn't been because Jesus had embarrassed them all. Well, that had added some heat to the proceedings, but they'd made the right decision, no matter how much pride had been damaged. The problem was that people didn't understand the job of being high priest, especially when you had to balance between the Romans and Herod and the Zealots, and when the Pharisees and the Sadducees were always wrangling with each other. And it was even worse when you factored in the great unwashed members of society. They just weren't following the rituals and rules that would keep them pure. All right, so they didn't have the money and time to do it. But that wasn't his fault. Ho, Caiaphas, a voice called. Come and have some food with us. As he turned to meet his junior colleagues, Caiaphas dismissed the Jesus matter from his mind, sure that he'd heard the last of him. Amen.